Let's talk a little bit about some strategies for packing your UVs. I've mentioned it a few times, but in case you're not familiar with the term packing your UVs, it's simply referring to the arrangement of the UV shells for optimum texture resolution and ease of use within the 0 to 1 UV space. And what I mean by 0 to 1 UV space is just in this box right here, in the upper right hand corner. If the origin is 0 and going to 1 on X and 1 on Y, this is where you typically lay out most of your UVs, at least to begin with. Once you've got all of your UV pieces unwrapped, the first thing I try to do is to get all of my UV shells to be roughly the same resolution. And what I mean by that is, basically I want all of these squares to be a similar size throughout the model. And at least the way I work, I start by unwrapping a piece at a time. So, I might end up with, the leg being quite large compared to the arm, compared to the eye, vice versa. And, there's several ways you can get them to be comparable size. You can either eyeball it, or there's some scripts available that will do it for you. You see that it kind of enlarged some things and shrank some other things down. In this case, I'm not going to use it because I've already sized things the way I wanted to. And that kind of brings me to my next point, which is to think about which pieces are more important than other ones, and then consider enlarging those pieces. And the pieces that are not as important, you can always shrink them down. At least for what I like to do, I don't think it's necessary to have perfectly evenly distributed texture resolution. I'll always enlarge the face a little bit more than the rest of the body, and the eye as well. So I like that extra clarity and focus for points of interest on the model. And there's some parts where it may never be seen. Maybe like the bottom of the foot, or if there was this is just basically a naked body, but if there were clothing and things like that, parts that aren't really visible, really don't need that much texture space. So I'll shrink those parts down. But that can really depend on what you're working on and the project and who you're working with. Sometimes it may be expected of you to keep things a little bit more even. As far as actually packing the UVs go, there are some ways to automate that, but to be perfectly honest, I've never really used one that came up with the result that I liked. There are too many things that I disagree with when things are just automatically done. And I think that's partly, I like to have some things upright, like the face, and like the eye, for example. I like to have these things arranged in certain ways, and when you leave it up to some algorithm or whatever is used to automatically generate the spacing, it it just never really works out for me. Maybe on some other kinds of objects and props, maybe it works out, but for a character, I'd rather do it by hand. And the way I generally go about doing that is I'll try to fit the larger pieces in first, like all of these little things here. They're probably little because on the model they're little, and also because they're probably not that important. If going by my philosophy of keeping unimportant things small and making the more important parts larger. So I'll generally keep those pieces off to the side first, and I'll worry about packing the bigger pieces, and then after that's done, I'll try to fit the smaller ones in the spaces in between. And I'll generally work along the edges first, especially if you got shapes like this that are pretty straight on an edge. I think those are good candidates to line up along the edge. I found that generally gets me started in the right direction for an optimal layout. Well, one thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about rotating and reorienting the UV shells being okay, and that is okay, except one thing that I do not do is I would not flip the UV shell. For example, on this leg here, I wouldn't flip it like that to try to fit it in. I mean, even if it ends up fitting better in the UV space, I try to avoid doing that kind of thing because I think it's nice to be able to predict the orientation of how the UV is compared to how it is on the actual model. Here you can see the red and blue of the UVs, and blue being facing the right way, and red being flipped. And this isn't really flipped, it's just these UVs over here are the other side of the model. This other side of the model over here is the one it's the side that I initially laid out the UVs for, and then I just mirrored over that, which is why this flip. Another thing you can try when laying out UVs is to group things together when possible. For example, if this model had clothing as well, then I might try to keep the clothing shells together in an area, and then the skin UV shells together in another area. Not only would this make it a little bit easier and more intuitive to work with, but it can also reduce problems with mip mapping, because when you do something like that, all of the neighboring UV shells will have a similar color. Like for skin, for example, it would be a pretty consistent color. So if a mip mapping error did show up for whatever reason, it wouldn't be as noticeable as if the face here if it was next to some jeans or something, and you might see a blue line appear as at a distance when the textures start to mip. But honestly, this isn't something I worry about too much. I think it's more of an issue at really low resolutions. I think if I can find UV space for something in an area that provides for more resolution, then I'd favor that rather than trying to keep the UV shells together. It's just it can be a balance between convenience and better results as far as resolution goes. But it would all depend on what the needs of your project may be. One thing you have to be careful of, though, is the space that you're leaving in between your UV shells, and also the space from the border to the edge of the 0 to 1 space. When in doubt, a little bit more space between them is better. You definitely don't want your shells to be very close like that. It'll probably take you some experimentation to see what works well for you. I think I have a decent sense for what works for me, just based on all the models I've built before. But generally speaking, if this was like a 512 map or something, I'd want I don't know, maybe at least 8 pixels in between, between 8 to 10 pixels in between each island. When you look at your 3D model from a distance, the accuracy of how the model renders the textures, especially on the edges, it can lose some accuracy. So if you don't have anything painted on the outside of your UV shells, then when you start zooming out further away, it can start to mistake the pixels outside to display instead of the pixels on the inside. And we'll go over that a little bit later in the baking phase and the texture painting phase. But for now, when you're laying out your UVs, definitely leave some breathing room in between. It's good to have an optimal layout. Trying to eke out as much texture resolution as you can, but you don't want to paint yourself in a corner and have your UVs too close together and then run into problems that will become pretty difficult to fix later on. And honestly, when the difference between a UV shell of this size and a little bit bigger, just like that, just to try to fit things in, it's not going to be that noticeable. So at least for me, I would favor something that is easier to work with.